All right, well, good morning. Glad to be here? Good. I was hoping you wouldn't say no. But, all right, one confession that I have before I get started. Some of you follow along with us during the service. You do your notes and all on the Bible app. And you've been looking for that, and you can't find it. And you're like, what's wrong with my phone? What's wrong with my app? Nothing is wrong with your phone. Nothing is wrong with the app. There's something wrong with me. All right, I forgot to put that in there this week, so I totally take the blame for that. It's my fault, so today you're just going to have to do it old school and write it down on a piece of paper or, thumb in the notes on your own kind of a thing. But I'll apologize, and I will have that fixed, and we'll be back on schedule, and everything will be right next week. I don't promise never to do this again because there's a high chance that I will. So that's just the way, my brain fails me sometimes. But anyway, out of the way, that's all good. What an incredible way it's been for us to start off a new year. Now, this morning, just so you know, today we're doing baptism. Nobody signed up for this particular service, but we baptized 3 people in our first service, so we're excited about that. Our church can celebrate. Even though we meet 3 different services, we know that something's going on here and people are taking their next step. So that's something for you to be excited about as a church. We're watching people walk and take their next step in Christ. So we did that the first service. That's a great way to start off a new year. But I was just thinking this week about this message and this series and just what an incredible way it is to start off a new year talking about grace and just getting that reminder that we often need that no matter what happened in the past, no matter what happened last year, no matter what's happened in the last 20 years, grace is always greater. Man, what an incredible way to get the year started and our minds, our hearts focused on the grace of God. And so we've been going through that over the last few weeks using this little equation that most of us learned way back in grade school. A very simple, mathematical, greater than, less than equation. Who would have thought that something so simple could become to mean so much? That grace is greater. And when you put it in that equation, it doesn't matter what you put on the other side. It doesn't matter how much you stack against grace. It's always greater. We talked about how grace is greater than our guilt. We're all sinners. We have failed God. What we deserve is His wrath and His judgment. But thank God His grace is greater. We took some time to acknowledge our weaknesses. We all have them. They may be different from each other, but they're there. We all have limitations. And rather than denying them or disguising them, Paul encouraged us to acknowledge those, embrace them, because God said, in your weakness, then you can be made strong because His grace is greater. And last week, as I had all these props up here doing this and that, and just talking about our circumstances. No matter what's going on in your life or around you, grace is greater than your circumstances. His grace always prevails. And so that's been some of the topics over the past few years. If you missed any of them, make sure you go onto YouTube and just catch up with us. You won't want to miss any one of those. And I just have to say, as a communicator, as a pastor, there's nothing really more exciting for me to talk about than grace. While I've admitted, though, there's nothing much more frustrating for me to talk about than grace. Because the fact is, how do you explain something that just can't be explained? And we've acknowledged the fact that, listen, you can listen to 1,000 messages. You could sing 10,000 songs on grace. You could read every book out there on the topic and still walk away not getting it, not understanding. Because grace is something that has to be experienced. Grace is something that changes us, that affects us from the inside out. And hopefully no one has this particular experience, but the only way I could really sort of describe it was if you could imagine that you had committed some heinous crime and you had been sentenced to death. And then someone came along and said, you've been set free. I mean, could you imagine what that would feel like? Like how exciting that would be. You wouldn't know what to do with yourself. That's what grace is. That's what it feels like to experience the grace of God. But despite all of that, Today is going to be just radically different. How we approach grace and what we talk about today is going to be, in stark contrast to our previous discussions on grace for the last few weeks. And I just have to put a warning out here. This is going to be a tough message for some people. It's a tough one to preach because it's just as difficult for me to practice as it is to present it. Okay, the ideas and the truth that I'm talking about here today. And hopefully nobody's going to get angry and get up and walk out. If you get up and walk out, we're all going to know why. So, if you're up for the embarrassment, go ahead. But, I don't believe that's going to happen. It didn't happen in the first service, and I don't expect it to happen here. But here's the thing. If today's message upsets you, don't expect apology from me. And that's not because I'm being arrogant. That's because today all I'm giving you is the Word of God. It's not my opinion. I'm not putting a spin on it. It's not my interpretation. Straight from the mouth of Jesus to your ears. And if that upsets you, take it up with Him. And so I'm just putting that out there just so we're all on the same page and we know what we're getting into. Because what we're going to talk about today has been described by some as messy grace. Messy grace. And here's why they call it messy. Because, see, up until this point, we've talked about grace from the standpoint of receiving it. We've been on the receiving end, and we're good with that. Everybody wants to receive grace. Everybody enjoys being the beneficiary of grace, but things get messy when you start talking about giving it. When you're the one who's called to extend grace, to extend, let's say, forgiveness to somebody else, that's when things get difficult. Because that's hard. And that's something that we typically resist. We love to sing about grace, to hear messages on grace, to talk about it, read Scripture that indicates our receiving grace, but things just get messy when we start being approached about giving it. And why is that? You got to think, why is it so difficult? Well, look at Proverbs chapter 14, verse 10. It says here that each heart knows its own bitterness. In other words, we've all been hurt and we know it. We know the pain of abandonment. We know what it feels like to be rejected, abused. We carry the burden of bitterness and betrayal, whatever it might happen to be. Each one of us has our own story to tell. And all of us have our scars that we could show that have been inflicted on us because someone else sinned against us. It's because of someone else's offense against us. And when we call to remembrance what that person did and their face comes to our mind, grace gets messy. Grace gets complicated. And see, Jesus knew that was going to be a struggle for us. And in fact, He had to confront it in the life of one of His own disciples, Peter. Jesus then tells Peter a story. And the story is found in Matthew chapter 18, and we're going to look at that here in just a minute. And it's the story, a parable, called the unmerciful servant. You could say it's the story of the graceless servant. And now, just so you know, what is a parable? A parable, to the best of our knowledge, is a fictional story that is told by Jesus simply to make a spiritual point. It's a story, it's a scenario, an illustration, if you will, something that He made up. It's not based on a real person. That's why He never uses any names. It's about just sort of, for instance, okay? It's an example that He uses to teach a spiritual truth. And the spiritual truth in this particular story, I'm just going to give it to you up front, is that grace is only grace when it goes both ways. Grace is only grace when it goes both ways. And so that's something that we're going to have to embrace. We're going to have to realize today that if we only intend to receive grace, but never give it, then we've stopped short of what it really is. We don't quite understand it. And not only that, we're also going to see in this story that it reveals to us the extent to which you are willing to give grace reveals perhaps the extent to which you have received it. Because those things work in direct proportion. So that's why things are going to be a little complicated for us. That's why for some of us in here, depending on your particular situation, it might get a little uncomfortable, because today's message, what Jesus is going to say to us, just might reveal our lack of understanding of His gospel. We think we know what it's all about. But for some of us, we only know our version of it. And we're going to see the truth today. And so you might wonder, well, how do you know? Is there any way to test the impact and the effect of grace on a particular person's life? And the answer is yes. It's a very simple test. If you want to know how much grace has impacted your life and has transformed you, then simply look at your ability and willingness to give it to those people in your life who've hurt you the most and who deserve it the least. That'll tell you whether or not you understand it, whether you really get it. All right? So, like I said, Jesus, He dealt with this issue in the life of one of His own disciples. And Peter came to Him with a question. And there's no doubt when you read this question that there's a story behind it. Man, I wish I knew what it was, but we just don't. We're not told. But there's a story. There's a person. There is an offense behind this question. And so he asked Jesus in Matthew 18, verse 21, Peter came to Jesus and he asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? All right, so we've been equating the big idea of this whole series to a mathematical equation. Something is greater than or less than something else. In our case, it's grace. And grace, as we've discovered, is always greater than something else. And so Peter, he approaches Jesus, and he has his own little math equation. And his math equation is something like this. How many times should I forgive someone who has hurt me, who sinned against me, and who has offended me? And he suggests as his answer, 7 times. 7 times. Now this question, if we were to put it into our equation, might sound like this. Jesus, is forgiveness times 7 greater than grace? Now I imagine in Peter's mind, he genuinely believed he was being more than gracious. Because you see, Peter was brought up being a Jewish man. He was brought up being taught the Old Testament. And he was very, very familiar with the law of Moses. And he would have been able to recall the teachings of the Jewish rabbis. And it said that Jewish rabbis would teach people according to, and citing Amos chapter 1 verse 3, you can go look at that later, but citing Amos chapter 1 verse 3, they would teach people that you were obligated to forgive someone of an offense 3 times. After the 3rd time, you were no longer under any obligation to forgive. And the reason for that, again, Amos chapter 1 verse 3 tells us about God and His forgiveness of the sin of Israel 3 times in this particular instance. But then on the 4th time, He issued His judgment. And so they extrapolated from that this standard. We forgive 3 times. On the 4th, no more forgiveness. We're going to write you off. And so again, in Peter's mind, as the backdrop, he's probably thinking, I'm more than gracious. In fact, my suggestion, what I am willing to do, the extent to which I will give grace is more than twice the required amount. So I'm golden. I'm good. Jesus is going to be so impressed with me. Probably going to give me a pat on the back. Say, wow, Peter, I'm so proud of you. I mean, that's incredible. You're going above and beyond. He's probably expecting to get Disciple of the Year. I mean, he's going out of his way to extend grace, right? And you might wonder, well, where did he get this 7 times? I mean, that's sort of an odd number just to reach out there and grab, like 7 times. How about that? And some deep spiritual thinker might say something like, well, in the Bible, 7 always represents perfection and completeness. And so Peter is suggesting that he's willing to offer complete and perfect forgiveness. Oh, that's so wonderful of Peter. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. There's no way that's what he's thinking. That's too complicated. Peter was a very simple guy. All right? Here's what makes sense to me. This is much more what I believe to be the case. I think perhaps Peter was hurt by someone. Not once, not twice, but are you with me? 7 times. And he's fed up. He's ready to be done with them. And so he's hoping that Jesus will agree with him. I'm done. Right? That's it. I'm through with you. It's like we can relate to that, can't we? That makes sense. Because for us, it might not be that someone's hurt us 7 times. It's not about how many times. But for some of us, it might be more about the degree, how bad they hurt us, how deep the wound was. Because it was only 1 time, but that 1 time feels like 7. That pain is as if it were multiplied by 7. So we get that. Now, I don't know what that situation is, and I don't know what happened to you. I don't know what happened to Peter. But the question's the same, isn't it? Jesus, how far is too far? How much is too much? When does grace run out? When is the offense? When is the hurt? When are the wounds greater than grace? Well, Jesus answers that question in verse 22. Then he's going to tell us a story, and we're going to get to that in a minute. But the answer to the question is, he said, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. And in some translations it says 70 times 7. And again, it's not about the number. The answer to Peter's question is never. He's saying, Peter, let me tell you something. Grace never runs out. Grace is never less. It's always greater. And just like it was for Peter, that's tough to hear, ain't it? That makes things messy. That's hard because our first instinct then is when we hear that to say, but wait a minute. Let me tell you what they did to me. Let me tell you how bad they hurt me. Let me tell you how wrong they are and how remorseless they are. And Jesus responds, doesn't matter. Grace is always greater. And that's tough. And see, like we may accept that truth on the surface because, we approach it, we claim to be, followers of Jesus. We want everybody to see us as Jesus following Christians. Like we agree with the truth on the surface because we don't want to be seen as pushing against something that Jesus said. But that doesn't make it feel true, does it? We might accept it here, but here, it just doesn't quite equate. It feels like grace has run out. It feels like there's not enough there to give. And so, this is why Jesus tells this story. He wants us to be able to wrap our minds around a truth that often feels untrue. And so he starts like this in Matthew 18, verse 23. He says, in light of what I just said, therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. And in other words, if this were today, we could be talking about a businessman, a CEO, someone who's looking to balance his books. And he notices that there's some outstanding accounts. There's some outstanding invoices. There's people who owe him some money. And he says, as he began to settle, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Now, I use the NIV when I'm preaching, and it says here that it was 10,000 bags of gold. And what the NIV translation did there was just insert from the original language some words or imagery that would help us, today, present day, equate in our minds to what Jesus would have been saying then. All right, so some translations would say something like, somebody owed a man 10,000 talents. All right, we don't know how much a talent was. We're just not familiar with that currency. But we all know what gold is, and we know the price of gold. And if we had 10,000 bags of it, we'd be set. That's a lot of money. Well, 10,000 talents in Jesus' day would have been approximately, give or take, 20 years worth of wages. All right, so let's just say, quick math here, easy math. Let's just say, on average, we make $50,000 a year. All right, you may make more or less, but just a simple illustration here. $50,000 a year. 20 years of that is $1 million. Now, let's just think. Can you imagine owing someone right now $1 million? You owe them, you're in debt to them to the tune of the next 20 years of your salary. Every dime you make has to go to them to pay off this debt. Now that's huge. That's an astronomical number, and I believe that Jesus chose that number intentionally as a way to exaggerate this situation. He's simply trying to make the point that this is a debt that is owed that can never be repaid. There is no settling of accounts, all right? So with that picture in our minds, he continues in verse 25, since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. Now that's harsh. We think, wow, he is being cruel. But again, in these days, harsh punishment for those who owed money but wasn't paying, it wasn't all that uncommon, especially if they owed this amount of money. They could be sold into slavery, their family made servants, everything they had basically sold off or auctioned off. You get as much out of them as you can to satisfy as much of the debt as possible. And so that's what this king, this CEO, this businessman had in mind to do. All right, so at this point, it would probably be good for us if we just pause for a second to acknowledge that this story is not about money. Now, we can draw from it some very practical and helpful financial principles, but this story is not about money. We're going to extrapolate a lot of lessons and a lot of truth that have to do with forgiveness, but it's not even really all that much to do with our forgiving of other people, other than the fact that's where we're going with it. The story, the big idea, what Jesus wants us to see here is that it's a story about us. It's a story about our sin. It's a story about us standing before God, standing before the King with a huge debt that we can't settle. You remember the Bible says we've all sinned and we fall short of the glory of God. There's no sense in denying it. And we can try all we want. We can work, we can do all kinds of things to try to work off our debt and try to pay it off. We can try to pretend it's not there, but no matter what we do, the debt of sin will never be paid off. There's nothing we can do about it. The books will simply never balance because God has kept track of every single detail, every single offense. He's not missed a one. Just like this CEO, he didn't miss not one account, not a dime. He knew where it was, and he knew where to find it. You see, God even knows about those things that we think we got away with. That time when we plagiarized on a paper in high school or in college, he knows. The drinking problem, he knows about that. The drugs, sure. The fudging on the timesheets, he's well aware. The cute blonde at the gym, or that guy that you just happen to run into at lunch every day in the office, he knows. And that sense of pride that sometimes we feel when the pastor fails to mention an example that specifically applies to you. And so you have this sense of remorselessness, and you think, well, he didn't call me out, so I'm just going to keep doing what I do. Oh, he knows. He knows. We've racked up a huge, huge debt because nothing's hidden from his sight. At this, verse 26, at this, the servant fell to his knees, something that every single one of us need to do. Fell to his knees and he begged, "Be patient with me and I will pay back everything." And everybody listening to this story, including us, in one voice says, Oh, no, he's not. There is no way. He cannot possibly pay back this amount of debt. And if Jesus were to respond, he would say, exactly. That's what I'm trying to say. You're making the entire point for me. This is a debt that can never be settled. And so he begs for mercy. And it says in verse 27, the servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. Do you guys remember over the last 3 weeks the memory verse, the theme verse for this series? Hebrews 12, verse 15. See to it that no one misses the grace of God. All right, so let's don't miss this, because right there is grace. Don't miss it. You just saw it in action. This is grace. $1 million debt canceled, wiped out completely. We need to understand that the terms weren't renegotiated. The interest on the payments weren't lowered. The king didn't settle for a lesser amount. He simply wiped it away. He canceled the debt. He let him go. Those are Jesus' exact words. And we're going to mention those phrases again here in just a few minutes. But elsewhere in the New Testament, you know what those two phrases are translated to? To forgive. He forgave him of the debt, and he let him go. He forgave him. He let him go. But here, let's keep going in this story. If you've never heard this before, this story takes just an incredible, unexpected turn here in verse 28. It says, but when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him, get this, and choked him and said, pay me back what you owe me. He demanded. And listen, I have read through this story hundreds of times, and every time I have the same reaction. I know it's coming, but I have the same reaction. Are you kidding me? Like, how can this be? Right after being forgiven of this huge debt, this guy goes out and he finds somebody who owes him a much smaller debt. He grabs him by the by the throat, and he's like, dude, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to choke you to death right here in the street if you don't pay me back my money. He was just forgiven a debt to the tune of $1 million. He goes out and he finds somebody who owes him 100 silver coins. Translations say 100 denarii, which is about 1 day's wage. So for us, maybe a couple $100. And he begins to choke a guy over it. That is unbelievable to me. But watch what happens. Verse 29. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, be patient with me and I will pay it back. Does that sound familiar? It should, because that is exactly what this guy said to the king. He fell to his knees and he begged him, be patient with me, I will pay it back. And you would think the guy would be, sure. That he would be more than gracious because he's being asked to forgive a much lesser debt than what he's been forgiven of. But watch this. Here's what happens. Verse 30, but he refused. And instead, he went off. That's typically what we do, right? Instead of forgiving, we just go off. And he had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. Now let's just think about this logically for a second. If somebody owes you money, a few $100, maybe $1,000 or more, I don't know. But somebody owes you money, and your thinking of how to get it back is to throw them in prison until they pay it back. How long is that going to take? How long do you think it would take an inmate to earn $100 selling Lucy's to other inmates? Now, you know what a Lucy is, right? You know, one cigarette. Like, it might charge like 25 cents for it. It's going to take a long time for you to get your money. You may never get it. So, see, that just doesn't make sense that he would do this. But this next part here is important. We need not miss this. Verse 31 says, when the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that happened. In a story about grace, we have an instance of righteous outrage. There's a community of people. These servants are a community of people, and they are furious. You know, a good way to think about them as a community of people is like, hey, we consider and we teach that Christians are a community of people. We, here at this church, we are a community of believers. We're going to go into a lot of what that means in our next series starting next week, called Community. That we're better together. We are a community of believers, a community of followers of Jesus. And right here, when this community of people sees one of their own act in a way that would cast a negative light on the rest of the community, they said, we ain't having it. And there is outrage. We've got a problem with this, and we're not going to stand for it. And so, for us to put this on the bottom shelf, and we can apply it appropriately here for us this morning, if we are a community of believers, and like I said last week, if it is our desire that New Life be a place of grace, then guess what? We will not stand for those who are associated with us to be graceless. We're going to call it out. If you want to be a person of bitterness and resentment and angry, and you want to hold a grudge against somebody the rest of your life, then you go ahead and do that. But don't tell anybody that you're associated with us. Because this is a place of grace, and we're not going to stand for it. That's rabbit trail, okay? But it was good though, wasn't it? Anyway, the community is upset because it's their desire, just like it's our desire, to reflect the heart and the actions of the King. That's all we want to do. We want to reflect the heart and the action of Jesus. And so here's what happened. Verse 32. When the master found out, right, he called the servant in And he said, "You wicked servant, I canceled all the debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?" And in his anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. Again, let's remember here, we're not talking about a few $100s. We're talking about a debt that cannot be repaid. Millions of dollars. 10,000 bags of gold. Listen, that's not going to take a long time. That's going to take forever. There's no chance that he will ever be able to pay that off in prison. But here's what's so important. And guys, let me just brace yourself, because this is the toughest part of the whole message. You got to remember, this is not a story about the money. The story is about us. The story is about our debt of sin. And so let's just go with this, all right? If the king, if the CEO here is a representation of God, and the servant who owes this huge debt is a representation of us and our sin, and he judges this servant by throwing him in prison until he can pay back this debt that can't be paid, what does that sound like to you and me? That sounds like hell, doesn't it? Do we all agree? That's what that sounds like. That's how God will judge. Right? If we're on the same page there, then let's just take this step further. All right? Verse 35, Jesus says, "This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart." Now, I know what you're thinking, because I think it every time I read this passage. Are you saying to me that if I don't forgive the person who hurt me, if I don't forgive that person who cheated on me, who abused me, who destroyed my life, who robbed me of my innocence, who took my children away, or who did whatever, are you telling me that I'm going to hell? No. That's not what I'm saying to you. That's what Jesus is saying to you. That's what the Bible says. You cannot like it, but take it up with Him. Because you see here, here's the thing. Before you get upset with me, you get ticked and you never want to come back to church here, or I know some of you pistol toters, before you want to shoot me, one, be warned, I shoot back. All right, but two, before you do that, let's just understand that Jesus is not saying that forgiveness is easy. Jesus is not saying that forgiveness isn't a process. Listen, this is something that you may have to work through over and over and over, even for the rest of your life. You may have to choose to forgive. But what Jesus is saying here, don't miss this, is that you can't give what you don't have. Remember, this story reveals to us that grace is only grace if it goes both ways. The extent to which you are willing to give it indicates the extent to which you have received it. You cannot give what you don't have. And if you sit here and say, I cannot or I will not forgive them, I will not give them grace, then what you're saying is, I have not received it. I don't get it. I don't understand it. Messy, messy grace. That's what it is. But go back to this story, and let's realize here that this graceless servant, you remember, he wasn't being asked to forgive a debt larger than his. His debt was much smaller. And now, the easy thing for us to do, the most natural thing for us to do is to say, oh, okay, that person, what they did to me is way worse than anything I've ever done to anybody. Are you sure? Because God's not asking us to interpret our sin on our scales. He says, look at you and your sin through my eyes. Well, that's a whole different equation, isn't it? See, when we do it that way, when we see our sin the way God sees our sin, then it's easy to come to terms with the fact that God will never ask us to give more grace than we've received. I mean, look at the cross. That's how much grace He gave us. He's not asking us to die for anybody. This is heavy. Let's just see our sin the way God sees it and do the math. Grace is always greater. Like I said, that's the toughest part of the message. Okay, so if you made it through that, you're good from here. That's tough. And I know it is. And so some of you are probably looking, you type A OCD people, you're looking at your notes, you're like, well, when are we ever going to get to the points? I mean, that's what I came here to do, fill in the blanks. Trust me, we're going to get there. But the reason I've taken this long, just to walk us through the text, like I said, this is not about my interpretation of the text. This is not about me coming up here and giving you some alliterated outline. Listen, the Word of God can say to you more truth than I can say in a million outlines. God has spoken here. Now let me give you a few hangers to hang it on. Something to attach it to. Here's your outline, okay? Some ways for us to think about this equation. All right? Number one, grace is greater than repayment. Repayment's the idea that things have to be made right. Before I can forgive, before we can move on, somebody has to make it right. We teach our kids that. Most people teach our kids that. We were taught that, right? If you do somebody wrong, if you break something of somebody else's, it's your responsibility to go to them and make it right. That's a great principle to teach our children. The problem with it is, as we grow into adults, it morphs into an unbiblical view of grace. Because now as adults, when somebody has hurt us, we have this thinking, well, until they come to me and make it right, I'm not going to forgive. I'm going to hang on to this thing. That's not grace. Repayment is not grace. See, there's two glaring problems with that. One, what if they can't repay? What if somebody hurt you and now they're dead? There's no way they can repay you. Listen, even if someone could repay you, if they could make it right, repayment is not forgiveness. I mean, it might be justice, but it's not grace. So let's not confuse the two. Don't forget, the king in the story here, he showed grace. He canceled the debt, wiped it out. There was no repayment. He wiped it out, and he let the guy go. And that's what God has done for us, and that's what He's calling us to do for others. Grace is greater than repayment. Number two, grace is greater than revenge. We know what it is, but the idea of revenge is that I'm going to make this person who hurt me feel the pain that I feel. People have sometimes referred to that thinking as sitting in the chair of God. You know why? It's because in Romans chapter 12, the Bible clearly says, do not take revenge. Thus saith the Lord, vengeance is mine. I will repay. In other words, God hasn't asked us to take revenge. God hasn't asked us to retaliate. That's His business. When we take matters into our own hands and we seek revenge, well, we're doing the work of God, and that's not our place. You don't retaliate. You don't lash out. You don't take revenge. Instead, your responsibility is to release. In other words, give up the right to retaliate. That's what the king, again, modeled. He canceled the debt, and he let him go. He forgave. Now listen, does that person deserve it? No. Is that going to make the pain that you feel go away? No. Is it going to make you feel any better or forget about what they did to you? No. But more often than not, when you choose to give grace, you are choosing, rather than hurt them, to live with the pain they caused you. That's why it's so messy. That's why it's so difficult. Grace is greater than revenge. Number 3, grace is greater than our resentment. You see, resentment's that idea that I'm just going to become more and more angry, and I'm going to hold on to this grudge, I'm going to hold on to the bitterness, but I'm going to do it quietly. This is what we do with our family, people really close to us. Like, you hurt me deeply, and life will go on, but the bitterness will go also. The bitterness is going to go right along with it, because I ain't going to forget it. And I'm not going to let you live it down. And I'm going to hold your feet to that fire as long as I can. It's like every day, as often as we can, we reach over and we hit a replay button. Over and over and over. And every time we revisit that pain, the wound is reopened. The infection goes deeper. And as I've said so many times before, holding on to bitterness and resentment is like drinking poison and expecting somebody else to get sick. Just doesn't work that way. I mean, let me remind you here that the guy in the parable, the one who chose not to forgive, wasn't he the one who ultimately paid the price? That's why grace is hard. That's why it's so messy. Why it's so difficult. You see, the key to understanding it all, and the key to giving grace, is to stop focusing on what somebody has done to you and start focusing on what Jesus did for you. Keep your eyes there. Because the better you can understand and the better you can wrap your mind about the grace you've received, the easier it's going to be to give. And so here's what I want you to do this week. I know it's going to be hard. But this week, I want you to think about that person. And maybe it's not one, maybe it's several. But I want you to think about that person in your life who's hurt you. And I want you to take time to roll up your sleeves or whatever, and I want you to look at the scars. I want you to pull back the layers of your heart. I want you to look at the wounds. And then choose to declare over those, I forgive because grace is greater. That's going to be the hardest thing I've asked you to do in this entire series. But if you do it, you will experience more freedom than you've ever experienced before. So with every head bowed and your